Good morning and welcome to Offshore Wind. The stakes have never been higher here on the first morning of Dcarbonise Week Virtual Sustainability Summit, a pre-COP event that features some of next month's milestone event sponsors and a host of true luminaries on highly topical and relevant panels. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director and co-creator of All Energy and the co-located Dcarbonise. Creation in the past 18 months has not been of in-person events, but a compelling series of webinars, 30 between May 2020 and March of this year, which attained well over 18,000 registrations and more than 20,000 views. Now here we go with Dcarbonise Week. Just one tiny housekeeping point. Check out what lies behind the resources tabs. You can see what is up next, find a full program link, the digital bag, and information on next May's All Energy and Dcarbonise. 11th and 12th of May at Glasgow's SEC are the dates for your diary. Naturally, we'd like to thank our sponsors. And for the first 3 days, these include our brand sponsors, Scottish Power, Shepherd and Wedderburn, and Ørsted, whose names you'll see alongside certain sessions close to their hearts. And our session sponsors, Hitachi ABB Power Grids, Kellis Midstream, SACN Transmission. If you didn't watch their video before this session, do hunt it out. SWEP and Driving the Electric Revolution Industrialization Centres. And thank you for being with us today, speakers, and all of you in the audience. Around 200 of you have registered. If you enjoy the session, let us know. And also let your colleagues know they can watch on demand. Now, what I was going to say was, without more ado, I'll pass over to Scott McCullum, a partner at Shepherd and Wedderburn. But Scott is having a few technical problems, so it's my great joy to introduce Julia Baroness Brown of Cambridge, the sector champion for offshore wind, to address us. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Judith, and it's great to be here this morning. And it was also great to wake up to hear that Boris Johnson is going to be speaking at the Conservative Party conference and making a commitment that all of our electricity will be in the UK will be renewable by 2035. I'm not quite sure what he means by renewable, because that appears to be what we might mean by renewables plus nuclear. But anyway, all green by 2035. And the Times also reports something about a commitment to 60 gigawatts. So I'm not quite sure whether that's an upping of the government's target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. But hopefully we'll find out. But it's a positive start for us. So getting to net zero in 2050 is going to need a lot more offshore wind, probably around 100 gigawatts or so. And that means about 30 gigawatts every 10 years. So, and that, of course, takes us currently through the government's existing target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. That means the energy system in the UK in 2050 is going to need to look very different to the one we have today. It's interesting to look at the Climate Change Committee's sixth carbon budget and net zero pathway report. That highlights the fact that we use about 2,000 terawatt hours of energy per year in the UK today, 2,000 terawatt hours. About 300 terawatt hours of that is in the form of electricity, and about 1,700, the large majority, 1,700 terawatt hours is oil and gas. So that's our total energy system. By 2050, we're going to be much more efficient. Of course we are. That's what a lot of electrification will do for us. Electricity and batteries, for example, are much more efficient than internal combustion engine. So we'll be much more efficient with a lot more electrification and some hydrogen production for those areas that we call difficult to decarbonize, things like steelmaking, industry, shipping, and some aspects of our heating and our transport. The Climate Change Committee's core scenario for the sixth carbon budget and net zero suggests we'll be using only about 1,000 terawatt hours of energy per annum in 2050. So half the energy we use today. But the big difference is that 700 terawatt hours or more of that will be in the form of electricity and less than 300 terawatt hours from oil and gas, with the remaining gas being used with carbon capture and storage, and the oil being used almost exclusively for aviation fuel, something which we'll need to offset the emissions from. So we move from an energy system which is about 15% electric to one where 70% of our electricity, of our energy comes from electricity. Our heat, our light, our transport, our communications, our industry, pretty much everything we do will depend on the reliable supply of electricity. About 200 terawatt hours of those 1,000 terawatt hours will be in the form of hydrogen, made from both electricity and from the gas with CCS. So hydrogen will make up about 20% of our energy supply, about the same figure as the 18% of global energy that McKinsey have recently estimated. Hydrogen is likely to be used mainly in industry and to produce ammonia for shipping, but as I've said, it may be used for some heating and some heavy transport applications, and for peak lopping in power generation, and importantly, for energy storage. Electricity generation in 2050 is likely to be 70 to 80% variable renewables, up from around 30% today. So there are a number of implications of this very different energy system and this very different electricity grid. Our dependence on electricity and the cascade impacts from a failure anywhere in the system, a failure which could, of course, come from a climate impact, from flooding, from a lightning strike associated with increased storminess, a failure will be so critical to us that it means that the resilience of the system needs to be even more of a focus than it is already today. We may even need a radically different approach to resilience. We may even need households that can run off their car batteries, other local storage, and solar panels as independent entities for a period of time. But it's a consideration that needs to be being designed into our systems from today as we have this large expansion of the electricity system starting. This is one of the issues that the Climate Change Committee has highlighted to the government in our advice in June this year on the third climate risk assessment. The climate resilience of the electricity system in essentially what will be an almost all electric economy is going to be absolutely critical. Secondly, we need to build a lot of offshore wind in the UK, but so does the rest of the world. So there are going to be plenty of opportunities for existing players and new entrants such as the oil majors. Indeed, the UK government may need to think about how do we ensure we attract enough of this investment into the UK, because there are plenty of other places people are going to be able to go to build offshore wind. We're going to need floating wind to get to 100 gigawatts by 2050 around the UK. We really do need to accelerate progress in floating wind and move it down a rapid cost reduction curve with all of the learnings from the experience with fixed bottom turbines. Governments need to avoid taking approaches that could unintentionally increase costs. For example, the recent competition for Crown Estate leases, where the lack of a price cap led to some very high bids, which could drive inflation at a time when we need to keep driving the cost of electricity down. Similarly, the tension between the cost of electricity and local content is something that governments need to consider. Next, I want to move on to the role of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a great complement to offshore wind, especially in Northern Europe, where offshore wind is a low-cost generator. Green hydrogen production to help balance the grid when the wind is blowing and we don't need the power. Storage of green hydrogen for periods like the first half of this year when wind speeds are unusually low. Ideally, you'd produce hydrogen where the electricity costs are lowest, but hydrogen transport is looking expensive. So producing hydrogen from offshore wind here actually seems a really good opportunity. It's interesting that Boris is telling us that we're going to have a grid which is renewables plus hydrogen. hydrogen has a really important role in making. Sorry, it's interesting that Boris was telling us, is going to be telling us in his speech that we're going to have a grid which is made up of renewables and nuclear. And hydrogen also has a role in making offshore wind and nuclear compatible companions on this grid. In all of the economic modelling, offshore wind tends to push conventional nuclear off the grid, and lower cost nuclear options, potentially small modular reactors, do the same to offshore wind. In part, this is because the different forms of generation have such different balancing need. But the option to generate hydrogen when you have too much baseload or too much variable power can be really important in integrating both into a zero carbon energy system. The grid, of course, will need to be very different, both the offshore and the onshore parts of it, and we need to be investing heavily now, especially in flexibility, well ahead of the need. New thinking will be needed to make sure the transition is as cost-effective and resilient as possible. Digitalization is going to be a key technology. The power industry is somewhat behind other industries such as aerospace in the application of sensing and monitoring technologies and the use of big data and artificial intelligence, enabling optimization across the whole system from current weather conditions, local wind strength and direction, to the condition of equipment and the power price. Digitalization will enable optimized design, operation, and maintenance across integrated systems of generators and storage, delivering electrons and molecules when and where they are needed in the most cost-effective way. We mustn't forget the environment. The development of the North Sea has been described as the urbanization of the North Sea. It's a powerful and worrying vision. Seabed planning is needed to ensure fishing, carbon storage, offshore wind, and nature can all coexist, with a particular focus on the opportunities for nature. And indeed, also, maybe some space for nature-based solutions for net zero, such as kelp farming amongst the turbines. And finally, skills. All of this is going to need a lot of trained people. Offshore wind is so important these days, it's hard to remember that this is still a very young industry. It's got a lot of growing and maturing to do, and governments need to do that alongside the industry, and we need to see that happen at speed over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Julia. I was in such a rush to get you speaking that I very rudely didn't mention who the other panelists were. You know, in my impersonation of Scott, I did not come top of class. We will be hearing shortly from Benj Sykes, Vice President at Ørsted. Later, we have Aileen MacLeod, who's Director of Business Planning and Commercial at SSEN Transmission. Charlie Jordan, Project Director, Scottish Power Renewables and Iberdrola. I'm sure I've got those in the wrong order, Charlie. And Andrew Elms, who's Head of Business Strategy and Government Affairs at Siemens Gamesa. It's now my pleasure to launch straight over to Benj for some words of wisdom from you, please, Mr. Sykes. Your time starts now.
Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you to Julia as well for those really interesting insights into where we're going. It's great to be alongside such experienced and knowledgeable voices, and I really hope we can spend quite a bit of time answering your questions and having a debate. So I will attempt to be brief. But first, a very quick introduction to Ørsted for those of you who may not know us. We're a green energy pioneer with about 7.5 gigawatts installed and 30 years of experience in developing, constructing and operating offshore wind farms. You may have seen one of them on the BBC News this morning. We've got about 5 gigawatts installed in the UK, which is enough to power about 4 million homes. And we've invested about £13 billion in the UK so far, and we very much hope to continue that pace of spending and build it up, particularly as we seek new areas to build, not least in Scotland through the ScotWind process. And we're also very involved in green hydrogen, which Julia referenced a number of times. So If you'd like to know more, in the interest of time, do go and visit our UK website. There's lots of interesting information there. But back to the subject, are we going to hit our 2030 offshore wind targets? Julia's mentioned it's 40 gigawatts in the UK with 11 gigawatts in Scotland, including floating wind, at least a gigawatt, not to mention that large-scale, gigawatt-scale deployment of green hydrogen, which is going to be essential. And the challenge is significant. We are making progress. We're at 12 gigawatts now, but that does mean there's still a long way to go. We've got to do almost 3 times as much again if we're going to hit the 2030 targets. But the sector is ready to deliver. There are, of course, a number of challenges that we face as an industry and that we're working on. And I thought it would be useful just to touch on a few of those. In fact, Julia's mentioned a number of them, and just talk about where we are at the moment and talk about how we're going to overcome those challenges to make sure that we do deliver on our commitment to the 40 gigawatts, but also ultimately the 100 gigawatts that we've talked about for 2050, and put offshore wind as the backbone of this clean energy system that Julia referred to. So I'll try to be brief. Not my strong suit, but here we go. First, the contracts for difference. And I think the CFD has proven to be a really strong, powerful tool to stimulate investment and to drive down consumer energy costs. And the decision to have an uncapped allocation round opening shortly is very welcome, albeit at very challenging prices. But to build and maintain the deployment momentum that we need if we're going to hit our targets, an explicit commitment to a timetable of regular allocation rounds at least every 2 years, and preferably more frequently, is essential. If we want to encourage the investment in green jobs and a strong export-driven supply chain, the pipeline of projects getting CFDs needs to be clear, and that means a timetable. Let's try and fix those dates so that the supply chain can be confident when those are coming and be ready to invest in manufacturing capability to support that build out. Secondly, and I'll be very brief because we're going to hear more on this later, the transmission system. The offshore transmission network review is a very welcome initiative to deliver a grid fit for the future, but we do need that to deliver soon. It's fiendishly complex, as we'll hear, but we have to get moving, not just offshore actually, but also onshore, as Julia has said, as we electrify the whole of the economy with transport, with heating, and moving industry where we can to electrification. It's the whole system needs to be fit for the future, and we need to get on with that, and we need to get on with it quickly. Thirdly, radar. Some of you will know that there are challenges of the coexistence of air defence radar with large offshore wind farms. Thanks to the joint work of the industry and the Ministry of Defence, we're close to delivering that solution to keep our defences intact as we continue to deploy offshore wind. But again, pace is everything here. And it's really vital that behind those great words we're going to hear from Boris Johnson, we see the government maintaining and accelerating the work it's doing in these areas, grid, radar, and so on, if we're going to keep the build out growing, increase the annual deployment, and hit those targets. Julia mentioned environment, and I do want to touch on that because it's probably the toughest challenge of all. Others we can solve with policy and with investment and with collaboration, but this one we can only solve if we work together. Our seas are already busy places with not only offshore wind, but other users, as has been mentioned, with fishing, shipping, oil and gas, for now at least, and many others. So we are going to have to work together to ensure we use our seas wisely as we address not only the climate emergency, but also the biodiversity emergency. We know that environmental pressures from climate change are the biggest threat to our planet and its ecosystems, but we must focus on prioritising the use of our seas and putting in place a fit-for-purpose planning system to ensure that we continue to deliver environmentally responsible solutions to the climate emergency as we build out more offshore wind. So there are many more challenges that I could talk about, but I'd like to give others a chance to speak and get on to questions. But before I finish, I'd just like to pick up on the vital point that we must not forget that 2030 is almost upon us. And we must make sure that we're ready to go beyond that 40 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts or even more by 2050 if we're going to reach net zero. That means replenishing the offshore wind pipeline. We're eagerly awaiting the outcome of our 5 ScotWind applications. I'm sure Charlie will mention his. They're ambitious gigawatt scale projects we have, not only contributing to the 2030 decarbonisation targets, but also delivering a credible pathway to full-scale floating projects, which, as Julia said, is going to be so important. And we've committed to invest up to £12 billion in Scotland to deliver those projects, never mind the green jobs that will be put in place for the operational phase of those assets. But we need to keep the rhythm of leasing rounds in Scotland and in England and Wales going. We're very happy to see the INTOG and the Celtic Sea rounds. But as Julia said, we need to make sure that these provide sufficient volume, that we don't see excessive prices being paid, because that will feed through to consumer bills, and that's not good for anyone. So we need to focus on capability to ensure that those who pick up the seabed through these leasing rounds are competent and able to deliver on time, on budget, project after project. So sustainable delivery and operational offshore wind, improving the health of the oceans as we go. That's why we have set an ambition in Ørsted for all of our projects commissioning after 2030 to be biodiversity net positive. I very much hope the industry will follow our lead, because if we don't, we will hit the buffers sooner than you may think. So just to summarise, this is a huge opportunity for the UK and for the industry to deliver clean energy and, crucially, deliver a just transition. And that means creating tens of thousands of sustainable, well-paid green jobs right across the UK, including in Scotland, as we'll do with our ScotWind projects, as clean industries replace traditional ones. And it means pioneering the wider energy transition, delivering the large-scale build-out of green hydrogen as part of that low-cost, reliable and clean energy system that Julia spoke about, ensuring that our energy-intensive industries, and importantly those who work in them across the UK, can continue to thrive. Thank you.
I was about to do the classic opening and shutting my mouth and no sound coming out. Somebody has to not unmute themselves, but I managed not to. Fascinating, both of you. My goodness me, what incredible figures that you're talking about. It really is extraordinary, isn't it? I'm so glad to hear something's happening about the aviation and radar thing. I remember way back when BWEA, as it was, held a conference at the Metropole Hotel in Brighton, that it was a topic even then. And if you can remind me what year that would have been, Benj, I'd be really impressed.
It was a long time ago, Julia, Judith. And I think all I would say, and Charlie may want to unpack this a bit, is I think the sector deal that we did 2.5 years ago now has been instrumental in driving the OTNR, the transmission review, in engaging at the most senior levels in the MOD. We're working with an Air Vice Marshal to solve this problem. I think the sector deal has been absolutely critical in creating that strategic collaboration between government and the sector to find solutions to these challenges. But we need to keep that fresh and we need to keep pushing ahead. But absolutely, radar's been talked about for decades, and it's great that we're finally moving forward.
I remember attacking some poor chap from the Ministry of Defence. I mean, what did I know about it? But I did at the time say, for heaven's sake, this affects our future and jobs. And he wasn't a happy man. Now, have we got Charlie here? He came and went. It's like the tide. We ought to have Wave and Tidal in here actually deciding what is going. Oh, he's joined the meeting. Are you here, Charlie?
I am, Judith. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, because it's your moment, because I know that you were keen to ask something about governments and whether governments are doing enough, aren't you? Or am I supposed to be asking you that?
Either way, Judith, that's no problem. So first of all, apologies. I seem to have a technical issue with our internet about here, so apologies for that. But I've been speaking with Scott previously. I mean, I think he was keen to explore whether governments are doing enough to try and get to offshore wind to where it needs to be. And in reflecting on that question, actually, I was thinking that we should probably have a question for each of us as to whether we're all doing enough when we frame that question within the context of mitigating climate change, and what more can we all be doing. However, certainly considering that from the offshore wind sector, I think it's fair to say we're in a very good place as a sector. I think we're now recognising an excellent collaboration between industry and government working in partnership. And that is in no small way credit to, I think, a number of the speakers and organisations behind the speakers joining this panel today. But I think the question is, in the short term, are we doing enough? And the answer is yes, we're getting what we want. You know, we've put forward the request to take this industry forward. We're all looking forward to the allocation round 4, and I think that should really help us maximise the cost-effective deployment of offshore wind. And I think that the absence or the government not introducing any capacity cap certainly sends the right signals to industry and supply chain. It's important we get these early projects off and running to let the supply chain invest. Then looking further ahead, we've got the next leasing round, looking at progressing those projects. And also, I think the way that the Scotland leasing round has developed has been excellent in terms of looking to maximise supply chain. You know, there's lots of great opportunities for investment there. And I think both of those will be very, very instrumental in taking our offshore wind forward. And of course, there's many challenges to continue to solve, be it planning, radar, dealing with the grid over the long term. But for me, the encouraging thing is that the right people are having very constructive discussions and able to try and resolve these issues. So the question of, are we doing enough? You know, there's so much more to be done. And when you listen to the targets, I think Baroness Brown was explaining, so much more will need to be done. But I think we start from a very good place. The UK is leading the offshore wind sector. We're looking forward to the excitement of floating and the impact that's going to have. So I think overall, a very good place. It was also mentioned about competition. And as this industry continues to globalise, I think we also need to be aware that we need to make sure we are then attracting investment here within the UK. So that's something for us to continue to work on as well. But overall, I think very positive from where we are today.
Now, Andrew, we're seeing vast amounts of investment in your organisation. How do you see the immediate future? Are you muted?
I thought I did. I hit the button. Sorry.
Well done, that man.
Second try. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Judith. So yeah, just quickly to give the context. Siemens Gamesa, we are an equipment manufacturer. We manufacture wind turbines, and we are violently defending our position as the market leader for offshore, a market that we helped develop some 30 years ago alongside Ørsted with the first offshore wind farm, Vindeby. So this is a place that we passionately remain and that we're trying to innovate and stay at the front of the market. And in the UK, we have something like 8 gigawatts of the 10.4 are installed off our CoStar Siemens Gamesa wind turbines. So obviously something we play very passionately in. So to answer your question about, are we doing enough? I mean, we are investing heavily, and we're investing ahead of what we see as a huge growth in the market. We have our main our main facility in the UK is our blade factory up in Hull, which is only 5 years old. We've yet to have a birthday party for it at its 5th year. It's produced something like 1,500 blades already. And actually, we've had to expand it already once because the market is growing so quickly and because the technology is increasing and increasing in scale and size so quickly that factory simply wasn't big enough in the first 5 years. And now we're looking to invest another close to 200 million to expand it for the 100-meter plus blades that we are now going to build for our more than 10 megawatt sized turbines that we're hopefully selling to people like Benj and Charlie. I think we've got to unpack a lot about supply chain. I think about how we invest in this country, but I think the government has done a fantastic thing with support of the industry as part of the sector deal in creating the market and promising the market, and therefore we will build into that market in return for a kind of promise for auctions, some topics around radar and around consenting and around transmission, as Benj has already expertly explained, and then a supply chain commitment that we will ensure that we create those green jobs. And I think we are primed to bring across oil and gas workers from that industry into that sector into ours, especially in Scotland with floating wind, and especially as we all start to sort of pick away at hydrogen and floating wind technologies that have yet to be nailed down. And therefore, we need to keep doing our bit in terms of a more balanced workforce, in terms of diversity and inclusivity, and in terms of supply chain jobs and growth. But the industry, having tried to kick the doors down for the last decade for offshore wind, we now have this sort of spinning door that we're just all trying to get through. So it's fantastic. We've gone from being sort of poo-pooed as an industry, from having sort of projects that nobody thought would ever last and would ever fly and that we could ever scale, to now having a genuine industrial competitor to gas and to nuclear, that we can all scale and keep growing, and that we can sell worldwide. So we need to keep doing it, but we need to keep doing it faster and at greater scale.
Yes, speed and scale, all important. I don't think that Scott is with us. Are you lurking anywhere, Scott?
I am, Judith.
Oh, hooray! Hooray!
Hopefully you hear me. I'm terribly sorry, everyone. It's an IT nightmare today, and I've been practicing my introduction for a week, so sorry about that.
Oh, well, sweetheart, do your introduction now. We'll all be absolutely flushed with excitement because, I've been bumbling my way through. So over to you, sir.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and apologies again, everyone. I've been very much looking forward to this session. It's fantastic to have such a stellar panel who are going to no doubt make my job very easy today. The session today, the heading is Offshore Wind, the stakes have never been higher. I think that's a very broad, very bold title. It's something that we can hopefully unpick and debate, but it allows us, I think, to look back on the many successes that we've had in offshore wind, but also, importantly, to look forward at what society really needs from the offshore wind sector, and whether the offshore wind sector is geared up to deliver that. And hopefully in the time remaining, I know you have started already, but hopefully we can dig into that a little bit. We can have a look in lots of different directions at the extent to which the various licensing rounds for seabed are going to unlock things, the extent to which the line of sight we now have to CFD can facilitate the sort of change that we need. And I think looking at the speed at which technologies like floating offshore wind and hydrogen are coming forward, whether they could be game changers as well. But there are lots of things that could yet get in the road, could yet slow down the deployment of offshore wind. So we are going to have a look shortly at grid, and I think that's a really interesting topic. The fact that we're trying to rejig, trying to change the way in which offshore wind farms connect into the grid, could well in the future create a new system with lots of capacity for offshore wind. But I think it's vitally important that in the short term, that's not allowed to stall the deployment of much needed gigawatts. So we'll be hearing about that a little bit later. And then I think the other aspects that we need to look at is the supply chain there to deliver the sort of ambitious rates that we're looking for. Is the consenting regime capacity there? Will stakeholders be able to input in the time scales that we need them to in order to create robust consents to get this all moving? So lots of things to consider. I suspect, and Judith, you will keep me right here, that we may well have had our scene setters from Baroness Brown and Benj so far. Is that right?
You're spot on there. We've had those. We've had them, and we've had Charlie make some comments, and Andrew dive in with lots from Siemens Gamesa. So your timing is beautiful. Can I suggest perhaps do you want to carry on with questions and some discussion now, or shall we ask Aileen to leap in and then we can have a really big discussion after she has presented?
Well, I wonder, Judith, if it's worth carrying on with a few questions in the panel debate just now, and then maybe in 15 minutes or so we can press pause and ask.
Go with your plan. I shall mute myself again and take a back seat because you're in the driving seat, that's for sure.
I am in the driving seat, Judith, but not able to see any of the questions that are coming in from the audience. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind chipping in as we go along here.
Yes, I mean, there was only one that was going to lead me beautifully into Aileen. There are others, and I can cut and paste them and email them to you. I'm getting adept at these things.
Fantastic. More technologically adept than me, it seems. So, okay, well, great. Well, I wonder if I can kick off with a couple of questions there. So it sounds like Charlie has already kicked off in Benj and Baroness Brown with the scene setters. I suspect, albeit I didn't hear it, that there was quite a lot of positivity in these scene setters, and hopefully people agree that governments have done their bits to a large extent in trying to set the foundations for what's to come. One question I had generally, as we talked there about the ambitions that we have in offshore wind and the targets, I just wonder, in terms of the interface that we've got going with governments just now, and Ben, this is maybe one for you, the extent to which the fact that the government have backed away from their industrial strategy, what status that now gives the sector deal, if any, and if that's now no longer in place, what is the mechanism for us to be feeding back to government in terms of what we need going forward?
Well, that's a really good question. I did actually mention the sector deal. Clearly, the modern industrial strategy, I think it's its proper title, that is from a previous era of government and ministers. That was Greg Clark's era. What's pleasing is that I still hear the sector deal referred to from government, not only in terms of the specific deliverables that both parties agreed to, obviously the regularity of auctions of CFDs, but also all these other areas that we're working on together, and of course building higher levels of local content. I see we've had a couple of questions about that in the chat. So I think the sector deal still has some currency, but I would definitely argue, and I actually did argue this a couple of weeks ago at a floating conference in Aberdeen, floating wind conference. The conference wasn't floating. That we should think about doing, if you like, a refresh. We're in a different world. We had actually 30 by 2030 as the sector deal's ambition. A month later, it went to 40. We now, as I said earlier, need to look to 2050. What have we got to get in place by 2035, 2040, and 2050 in order to fully realise offshore wind's potential? So I think there is another iteration, if you like. I'm sure we won't call it a sector deal, and I think that's probably fine. But I think this strategic intertwining of government and industry is vital to make sure that we don't just cherry pick the things that we want, but that we work strategically together. So very much hope there's appetite to do something in terms of that. But the government remains very committed. If you look at the large-scale investment in ports, infrastructure and manufacturing, inward investment, I think you can see government remains very serious about working with industry to bring the full benefits of offshore wind, not just in terms of reliable, clean electricity, but also in terms of jobs and that just transition, bringing those to the UK.
Okay, that's great. And in terms then, and this may be something that perhaps you could come in on, Ely, but in terms of the extent to which that there's joined up thinking at government level, a sort of overview or master plan, do you get the impression, Ely, and again others will have a view on this, whether or not government are looking at grids in the context of offshore wind, if they're looking at hydrogen and the way that hydrogen needs to come forward in timescales to maximise opportunities in offshore wind? Is there that read across in that master plan at government level, or is it compartmentalised?
I think that's an incredibly topical question as well. There's a lot of activity on quite a number of fronts at the moment, and it's almost a case of keeping tabs on all the different activities, and sometimes you can get yourself tied up with, well, each activity is trying to deliver one individual outcome, but where is it all being pulled together? That said, I think I feel in particular kind of heartened by the approach that's been taken by government, and the kind of the commitment that's being shown across a number of different departments towards delivering this. And I think certainly from my perspective, grid has had a tendency to be a bit of an afterthought when it comes to the slightly cooler and smarter and trendier and, for a terrible word, sexier wind turbine end of things. Grid's boring, but now I think there is real acknowledgement about the criticality of grid and about the need to tie together those kind of targets and ambitions that we're seeing, particularly in the offshore space, with making sure that grid doesn't end up being the barrier to delivering on that. And I mean that in a holistic sense, not just in relation to the strategy, the design, the planning, all of the environmental factors that apply in grid as well, but also the supply chain. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us as a country. We talked earlier about the fantastic turbine factory in Hull. There's certainly huge opportunity around about grid equipment and grid infrastructure, and not just constructing it, but also maybe manufacturing it in this country too. So I'm very optimistic about that in our future.
Fantastic. And while you're on it, Aileen, in terms of hydrogen, do you think that has a big interaction with grid? Does that potentially open up the capacity or the contribution that offshore wind can make if we get hydrogen or other storage things right? Is that something that's a critical part of your planning when you're designing a grid network?
My short answer on that one right now is I don't know. I think it's relatively early days in understanding how hydrogen is going to develop and the contribution that it's going to make to our future energy system. I think we all believe that it will make some contribution. The question is how much and what part of our energy mix it comes through in. Now, in the north of Scotland, we've sort of started to kind of engage with some of the parties in that early stage of hydrogen development to understand, can it be considered as part of the talked earlier around about resilience and the criticality of resilience and security of supply. Is it part of that security of supply story, or is it something, where is it going to be manufactured? Where is it going to be used? Is there a transportation case, and how do we factor it into future planning? So watch this space. I suspect in 12 or 18 months' time we'll have a much clearer answer to that question. But right now there's still some serious thinking that needs to be done.
Okay. And in terms then of the sort of voting piece, moving on, so sort of keeping to the policy context, but moving on to voting, do you get the impression, and this is probably one to Charlie and Benj in the first instance, but do you get the impression that now floating wind is very much tucked in underneath wind generally? Or do you think that there are still some different challenges which merit distinct lobbying efforts for floating? Are they now part of the mainstream? Charlie, I don't know if you can take that one first.
Yes, certainly, Scott. I mean, I think certainly very enthusiastic about the opportunities for floating, and I think that the Scotland Leasing Ground should, really, I think, give it a platform to bring forward a number of projects that take us from the prototype stage now into reality. I think, though, we do have the ongoing challenges about how do we then make these projects a commercial reality. There's a tremendous amount of effort looking into the technical solutions, the cost reduction, the industrial benefits, but we're going to have to consider then at the time how competitive they are against other technologies and how we can bring those forward. So I think that's an area certainly that's going to continue to evolve and continue to try and find a solution so that we can be then realising the benefits of floating wind in the same way we're currently doing with fixed bottom.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd fully... Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd absolutely support what Charlie just said. I think we need to be really focused on learning what we did right and didn't do right in terms of the fantastic story of cost reduction and technology development in fixed bottom offshore wind. It's a tremendously positive story, but there are lessons to be learned, and we must make sure that we move even more quickly with floating. We are still in a world where there are many different archetypes of foundation. The technology is maturing fast. And I think for me, it's going to be critical that we move at the right pace so that we get the sort of 200-300 megawatt scale project out there and proven with a proper transmission system rather than connection directly to shore. We need to prove all of that balance of plant works in the floating environment, and then scale up to the gigawatt. And I think that pathway to getting to gigawatt scale floating, we need to work on. I don't think we're quite there. And there's a lot of talk about, let's do gigawatt scale projects, which we definitely need to, but we need to get there in a way that makes sure we prove the key elements of the technology that still are in their infancy, I would say.
Okay, well, that's great. So I mean, it sounds like, and there's a few questions coming in relation to the fact that we've got now that good track record of deploying some of the world's largest offshore wind around about UK waters, and that presumably gives, as I say, a bit of confidence, a bit of a template to move forward. But looking at both fixed bottom and I suppose looking at floating, I wonder if the sort of lessons that have been learned that can be taken forward are necessarily going to help out when we try and scale it to the extent that we're trying to do. I don't know if, Andrew, you have a view on the different challenges that we might have coming up.
Yeah, I think so, Scott. Thank you for that. And I think I'll just build on Charlie and Benja's points that out to 2030 we see it mainly fixed bottom, but that we're getting, say, 3 to 5 gigawatts of floating up and running by then. So we've just seen the Kincardine farm being commissioned, which is great. Before that, we've had demonstrators of high wind, both in Norway and in Scotland. So we're seeing great availability from those wind turbines, but obviously they've been done in very small scale, a handful of turbines. So getting that ability to industrialize the preparation and therefore installation of those wind farms is going to be the key to bringing that cost of electricity down. So beyond 2030, we see that starting to happen. Up to maybe 100 gigawatts of floating wind by 2050. And that's going to be partly about selecting those winners of the foundation designs that really are going to help industrialize the installation of those turbines. The turbine technology is already there. And scaling that turbine technology is going to be a significant part of helping the floating technology, because you're already getting those economies of scale and size for the amount of megawatts that you're installing per turbine. And therefore, it's going to be about that floating foundation and the anchoring systems and the cabling systems, and then the operations and maintenance and installation logistics that are required to keep those going. Those are the bits that we're going to need to see industrialize and kind of scale and speed up to ensure that the costs come down commensurately. I think there's a great opportunity there for the UK in terms of supply chain and technology, especially that transition from oil and gas, where they have the knowledge about floating structures and about cabling and about connections, and also the sort of deep water ports that we see certainly in the top of the UK. So I think there's a real opportunity there, and that's where we need to see the innovation investment go to make sure that that part of the industry scales. But it definitely is going to need a support and kind of special incubation treatment for the next decade in order to allow that scale to take off, just like it did for fixed bottom. Listen to us talking as if fixed bottom is so mature, and it's only a couple of decades old, and a decade of real scale and costs coming down. So isn't it great that we're already talking about the next innovation that we are going to industrialize?
Yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. And I wonder, just on the back of that, whether that innovation is being focused in the right areas. So it sounds like from what you're saying there, Andrew, that we've got some parts of floating already mature enough to sort of identify the front runners in terms of the actual structures themselves, but that we need to now focus in on the bits that aren't necessarily working. So we're maybe in a sort of general innovation, people still trying to find the solution mode in some elements, but actually in some other aspects of floating, we're trying to now hone down and just polish up the technologies that are most likely to work properly. I wonder, Julia, if you can comment just on the way in which offshore wind go about doing that sort of innovation. Is it sufficiently targeted? Do we get it right in terms of making sure that the resource is going into the right areas? And who actually makes those decisions? Is it a collaborative discussion amongst industry, or are people still trying to plough their own furrow? Do you have an impression of that?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, actually, but I was thinking, hearing what people were talking about earlier, that as Ben just says, in terms of a refresh of the sector deal, I think a refresh of the sector deal with a real focus of what support is needed, with the industry working together with government to really get floating down this, accelerated down this industrialization path, and really learning. The Offshore Wind Industry Council is really a great place, with the people around the table who know the learnings from the experience in fixed bottom. So actually, to be the people planning out the kind of roadmap that's needed, the kind of government support that will be needed, and the kind of engagement with the supply chain, to make sure it's both contributing and ready for the changes that are going to be needed. So I think I support very strongly Benji's suggestion of a refresh for the sector deal, which could very well, I think, pick up a number of these issues and ensure that the industry is working together on them where it's appropriate, and of course where it can do so.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. I think now's probably quite an opportune moment just to press pause on this half of the panel debate, and to move on to Aileen to provide for us a bit of learning, a bit of an overview of the offshore transmission network review. What does it mean? How is it evolving in Scotland, and what does it mean for offshore wind in the short, medium and long term? I suspect that will then spark lots more questions, and maybe then in the second half of the panel debate we can answer those questions and also look more generally at the barriers that still exist in offshore wind, and how what work is going on to try and remove those and maximise the potential. So Aileen, would you mind giving us a bit of an overview?
I can do, and I have a couple of slides, not least because I cannot talk without a graph. I don't know if that's a positive or a negative about me, but also following on from what we were just talking about, I'm actually joining you from the National HVDC Centre here in Cumbernauld, which is very much a centre of innovation and trying to drive forward those technological changes, not just relevant to the transmission system, but also for the connection of offshore wind and the scale that we've been talking about today. And this is also an example, I think, of fantastic collaboration. So although the HVDC Centre is part of SCN Transmission, it's very much run in collaboration, not just with the other transmission licensees in GB, but actually with the wider industry. So I have some slides up. Hopefully you can see them now. And I spoke to Scott last week around about kind of saying a few words from the perspective of grid at this session today, and at the same time I was very closely watching what was happening in the pre-COP26 discussions that have been happening in Milan, and I actually listened to Greta Thunberg's presentation at the Youth for Climate conference. You might have seen some of the snippets on the news. The theme blah 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 was widely reported. Well, for me, I actually found that quite an uncomfortable listen. That said, Ms. Thunberg is always optimistic, and she believes that with action we can avert the worst of climate change. And in her speech she said, "Fighting climate change calls for innovation, cooperation and willpower to make the changes that the world needs." I think we've already heard some of that today. So I'm going to try not to blah, blah, blah. Instead, I'm going to talk about action. I'm going to talk about action that's been done, action that's underway, and actions that are coming next. I'm also going to talk about collaboration and the role that we all have to play in achieving the 2030 targets, a critical step on our pathway to net zero. So thank you to Scottish Government, to Marine Scotland, to Crown Estate Scotland. Action done is the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind energy. Action underway is the ScotWind leasing round and the recently announced spatial planning exercise for oil and gas decarbonisation, or INTOG. Action next is the spatial plan for offshore grid. Together, this spatial planning work has been critical to give us confidence that the 40 gigawatts by 2030 can be achieved. We know where offshore wind can be sited, and we have a programme for leasing. And if you turn to the next slide, please. The numbers very much speak for themselves. The lead time for development means that we know what the component parts are from operational, consented, AR4 in England and Wales, and ScotWind. And to be clear, achieving the Prime Minister's 40 gigawatts by 2030 target, which as we've heard may well be climbing upwards, is going to require a significant contribution from ScotWind. I heard a senior industry leader last week talk about 2030 or thereabouts. Let's not slip into that language. It should be 2030 at the latest. Next slide, please. So I think we've already heard thank you to the UK government for the contracts for difference mechanism and the allocation for offshore wind, although we'd like to see that committed to on a regular basis. Thank you to the offshore wind industry and its supply chain for drive and innovation and cost and delivery. Actions done, actions underway and poised for action next. Lease award, development and delivery. Thank you again to the UK government for launching the Offshore Transmission Network Review, or OTNR, and with Ofgem distinguishing in that the pathway to 2030 workstream. Very much an action done. Action underway is the pathway to 2030 Holistic Network Design, or HND. By the end of this year, so by the end of 2021, the ESO is tasked, in collaboration and consultation with others, in setting out the transmission system investment requirements for having 40 gigawatts of offshore wind connected by 2030. I don't think you can understate the importance of this task. Put simply, if there's not a wire between the wind farm and the consumer, then there's no point in any of this. Next slide, please. This graph illustrates the scale of the grid challenge. So if I just talk you through, on the horizontal axis, you've got time from now through to 2050. And on the vertical axis, you've got capacity. And this is just for the north of Scotland, so just for the SSEN transmission operating area. So the blue line at the bottom is winter peak electricity demand in the north of Scotland. Basically, not much at all. The three green lines higher up are electricity generation scenarios under 3 different net zero pathways. Basically, lots and lots and lots. All of this excess electricity produced in the north of Scotland, the gap between the blue and the green lines, needs to be transported to consumers in the south. This needs grid. Lots and lots of grid. Upgrades to existing grid and the development of new grid, including big, fat, nowhere to hide subsea cables that are going to transport power from north to south. So we just look at the bit of the graph that's from now to 2030. In installed capacity terms, our net zero pathways in the north of Scotland forecast generation capacity to triple. So from 8 gigawatts today to over 20 gigawatts by 2030. Half of this is expected to be offshore, so the outcome of the ScotWind leasing round, and half of it is going to be onshore. And this is what was referred to when we talked earlier about you can't separate onshore and offshore. You need to think about both of them together. And this is the grid answer that's being produced as we speak now in the OTNR pathway to 2030 work. Next slide, please. Fortunately, it's not a standing start. The 10-year planning horizon for the electricity transmission system means we've already done an awful lot of the legwork. This map is from the November 2020 10-year statement, and an update to the ETIS is going to be published next month. I expect much of the reinvestment shown here in jolly purple, so you can see the highlighted bits of the onshore infrastructure, but also offshore HVDC cables. I expect much of this to form the basis of the pathway to 2030 report. So as I say, it's not a standing start. We already have a good understanding of what the grid investment is required in order to meet the 2030 targets. So the pathway to 2030 holistic network design is action underway. Action next is network design, consent, and to start building by the middle of this decade. Grid investment takes a long time, not least to ensure that we can understand and minimise our environmental impacts. But a go decision early next year means 2030 at the latest is very, very doable. There are some, and I'm one of them, who believe that we can go faster, that 2030 could actually be 2028. And there are some, and I'm one of those too, who believes it's taken us too long to get to where we are now. Next slide, please. So three large elephants in our room. First is a nervousness to make big decisions, to award lease, to award consent, to change the rules, to sanction investment, to try new things. This, at its worst, can manifest itself in consultation, collaboration, and to seek no dissent before deciding. Yet time is not our friend. There is a lot to do, and we do this in a global market. Certainty of intent of investment sends a strong signal that the UK is open for business. Second is the risk of distraction. This might be due to events elsewhere, global pandemic, for example, or fiddling while Rome burns, by spending time worrying about things that don't actually contribute to that bigger goal, the 40 gigawatt target and net zero emissions. Much reform is proposed to the market, to subsidies, to the system operator, to network delivery. Some of this is essential, but not all of it. A colleague likes to remind me regularly, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Third, and this one I think is the African of the elephants, is the cost to energy bill payers. The phrase, a net zero transition at the lowest cost, tends to follow up with a focus on the cost in the here and now. There's a cost of delay, there's a cost of not acting, of failure, and we can't fail. I am definitely straying into blah, blah, blah territory, so let me conclude with my final slide with a call to action. So Greta Thunberg concluded her speech by saying, it starts with the people. It starts with facing the reality of the situation, as uncomfortable as that may be. It starts with taking action. So if we all act, we all do our bit, we all make decisions, we avoid distractions, and we face that reality, then I strongly believe that we can achieve 40 gigawatts by 2030 at the latest. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. That's really useful, a really good overview. I wonder if others on the panel have any thoughts. I mean, my main thought in all of this is it all sounds fantastic in terms of getting that coordination right, working together to do that. I am conscious, though, that there are projects that are ready and rearing to connect now throughout the UK, and projects that are coming hot on the heels as well. And I suppose it's making sure that we're never pressing pause on any of those projects, and we're making sure that there are contingencies in place and that coordination is running alongside, rather than is necessarily holding any part up in order to achieve that coordination. But I don't know if others in the panel have a view on how they see this playing out.
I guess I would completely echo the comments that have been made, and actually I did make myself, around the urgency of action. I'm hoping that the national policy statement updates that are coming through will make it easier to drive through to solutions. And as we've heard, it's important we move away from endless consultation. However, we have to take everyone with us on this, and I think that's a tension that is going to be vital to keep focused on, because we cannot just do this at the expense of local communities, or if we're going to build a big offshore grid, at the expense of the environment. So we have to take all of the stakeholders with us, and I think it's incumbent on us as industry to be that catalyst to pull people together into those conversations, to make sure that we tease out those issues that can be solved, and we solve them before the tough decisions have to be taken on how we move ahead. But urgency is everything right now, not just for 2030. And quite right, pointing out that a number of projects already are struggling to get grid connections commensurate with their development and construction timeline. But out to 2040, it's only going to get tougher.
I think, there's a tendency to underestimate the benefits and the value in the design and the development phase, and to focus very much on the kind of the consenting and the delivery phase. And certainly one of the things that I hear regularly, from not just from statutory authorities, but from communities as well, is wanting to see that bigger picture, wanting to see where it is that we're going. And I certainly feel, as working for the grid company, that to a certain extent it's incumbent on us to be able to tell that story, to be able to show that this is where we're heading, this is why, and that we're doing this in a managed and coordinated way. And yes, it's going to be tough, I think, on some communities that are going to be asked to host this infrastructure, and all of the challenges that go with that. And there are going to be side effects that we're not going to like from this, both environmental and in terms of the cost to consumers' bills. But I know that people are working very hard to minimise those side effects, and it does require an honest conversation, and not just a dance of the seven veils where you only show a tiny bit each time. We're doing this, as part of a national decision, in order to achieve national ambitions and national targets, and been able to demonstrate that it is well thought through and it is being undertaken in a strategic way, I think will go a long way to alleviating some of those valid concerns.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think your points are well made, in terms of the need for that collaboration and honesty as well. And I think, I suspect there is a bit of a difference in a public attitude to all of this now that we have the recognition of this climate emergency. Just looking a little bit at the other barriers that still exist to the deployment at the scale of our ambition here. Benj and Charlie, this might be for you guys in the first instance, but I'm conscious there are lots and lots of different working groups, lots of inputs from government, from the Crown, from industry that are going full tilt at trying to solve certain barriers to growth. I must admit I get quite confused about all of the different groups and work streams and who's doing what. I just wonder if you have a view on the extent or the degree to which these groups are properly collaborating, both north and south of the border, and whether we are most efficiently trying to target the resource at the areas that will give us most bang for buck.
Yeah, it's a really fair question. Perhaps we should set up a group to coordinate all the other groups. But seriously, we have the Offshore Wind Industry Council, which I think has been helpful in engaging with government in Westminster. We have SOWEC, the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which is, if you like, a Scottish equivalent and is engaging very strongly into Scottish government. So I think those are two really important bodies. There are numerous other forums, whether they're regional, local or national. I think we are reasonably well joined up. I think the issue perhaps is that we don't explain how all these bits of the jigsaw puzzle fit together, and there's certainly something we can do as industry leaders to create that sense of coherence and alignment across all of these groups. I think for me, there's a particular area of challenge there, and that's in relation to the work we're doing around the environment and sustainable development. There is a plethora of groups looking at different issues, and I think, again, it's incumbent on us in industry to make sure that we can demonstrate that these things are all joined up. There are a couple of other initiatives to add to the list, which it's important as well to see as potential tools to address this. One is the Prime Minister set up the Build Back Britain Business Council, I think, Build Back Better Business Council. Julie, you may know the name. And that is very much focused on how do we accelerate. There's a working group looking at how do we accelerate offshore wind. And that is tapping into all of these other groups to find solutions, but importantly also has the ear of number 10. So I'm hoping that will help us push through some of the more difficult areas of debate to conclusion and enable us to move on from debate into implementing solutions. So agreed, absolutely, Scott. It's a complicated ecosystem. The jigsaw puzzle can be confusing, and I think, as I say, it is up to us to make it function well and be clearly understood.
Scott, I can challenge his comment as well, and I fully agree with what Ben just said. I mean, what is clear is no matter what group or what forum, it comes down to the same issues, barriers for growth, and I think each of the groups have got a real commitment to be working through them. I think that the B4C that Ben was speaking about, the good thing there is it seems like a good opportunity to consolidate all of these, and given that we seem to have the ear of the Prime Minister in his office, the ear of the Treasury, it's a really good opportunity to elevate these things. You know, we've made a lot of progress over 10 years, but we can't wait another 10 years to try and deal with the next set of barriers. And what was interesting in those discussions is that when you start looking for quick wins, you know, how do we stop it taking 10 years to develop an offshore wind farm? What you realise now is the decisions today will actually start having a material benefit in 5 years, 10 years to come. And a lot of these are quite fundamental changes we need for the benefit of the wider industry.
Yeah, and I would just like to add one point to Charlie's really important point, and that is we've always seen these things that we are really difficult to sort out around planning, around coexistence, around the grid. And we've always said, you know, it's just going to take so long that we've never actually started. And they'll always take 5 years or 10 years to deliver results, which is all the more reason why we must press ahead and solve them now. Otherwise, we'll have this conversation in 2026 and we'll just be 5 years further behind than we already are. So the tough things are the things we've got to get on with now, however long they're going to take. In fact, particularly because they're going to take so long to feed through into faster, smarter project delivery.
Yeah, no, all very good points. And Andrew, bringing you in, we're getting a few questions about the supply chain, and in particular whether or not we've done enough to whet the appetite of the supply chain. Has there been that investment by the supply chain? Do they see the pipeline that means that, for example, that they would be switching from their role in, for example, the oil and gas supply chain across to offshore wind? Is there now sufficient recognition? Is there now sufficient investment that means that the domestic supply chain can play the part that we need them to play to reach the ambitious growth targets?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I thought so, but just last week having a discussion with a supplier that had gone to the Global Offshore Wind Conference in London, you know, therefore they're invested in the industry, but they themselves, when I'm sort of challenging them about what they could do to get into offshore wind manufacture, kind of questioned the certainty of the pipeline. So, you know, I think it's absolutely certain. Why wouldn't they, sort of thing? But obviously there is obviously work to do to convince that way. You know, how much more could you want? I would say, you know, it's in the carbon budget, it's in the sector deal, it's in the 10-point plan, it's in the energy white paper, it's in, and of course it's being doubled down on right now, and hopefully even more certain beyond 2035 out to 2050. So for me, it's never been more certain for any industry, and it's a great place to be. I think there are some challenges around. It's not all great, you know, when we've got everybody looking a little bit of, especially at supply chain, we're involved globally, and obviously everybody wants their own factory in their own backyard, and that doesn't actually support bringing the cost of electricity down. As Baroness Brown said earlier, there's that competition between, if you want it local, that's not necessarily the cheapest form of electricity. So I think we've all got to grapple with that dichotomy. But on the subject of the energy transition and the just transition, I do think that further north and into Scotland are in a great place for that they have some of that industry and that technology and that know-how and that skill base that is oriented to offshore work and to complex project supply chain and innovation work. And therefore that transition, especially for floating and then into hydrogen, is going to play well into their economies and their skill bases and their culture and skill base. So I think some are making a lot of the whole just transition. I think we're going to do it. In fact, I'll give you a little example. 5 years ago, nobody in Hull knew how to make an offshore wind blade. it took us a couple of years, and now we've got over 1,000 people who now know how to make offshore wind blades, and we have centres of competence and research and development, and postgrad students doing their PhDs on it, and sort of small, sort of supply chain entrepreneurs popping up in order to support it, backed by all of the sort of government, academic, and industrial investment that's gone into it. So I think we can transition a lot quicker than we think, as long as the approach, the commitment, and the multi-party investment is there. We've shown it can be done in one industrial hub, transitioning to green energy, and we can certainly do it in sort of Scotland and north of the border, where we've already got an energy sector.
Okay, fantastic. Right, we are fast running out of time. It seemed a very quick session for me, Audrey, because I turned up so late. So I think it just remains for me to thank our panel very, very much, and Judith for covering my role in the in-between, but also to thank our audience for they've contributed as well. So hopefully see you next year, and hopefully we'll be in person so I don't have to grapple with IT issues. But thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks all.